I'm Daisy Okoye, and you're listening to Kinda Sorta Brown with the University of Chicago's Public Policy Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Kinda Sorta Brown. I'm one of your co-hosts, John, here with one of my other wonderful co-hosts,
Chase, Lito.
Exactly. Today we will be continuing our previous conversations about the impacts of medical and scientific racism, specifically focusing on how these factors affect the relationships that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color have had with mental health. We're going to dive into the stigmatization of seeking help, why those stigmas exist, what it means to protect your energy, and the importance of claiming it. We will be joined today by Ella Bradford, who is the co-chair of the Health and Wellness Committee at the University of Chicago, and talk to her about balancing being in college with mental health. But before that, let's dive into the role that psychiatry has played in creating the current racial disparities within mental health in the Melanin Archives.
Let's dig into the Melanin Archives. On March 7, 1851, a physician named Samuel A. Cartwright delivered a report with the Medical Association of Louisiana in which he defined the term drapetomania as a mental disorder that caused enslaved people to have the desire to flee from servitude. He also described a mental illness called dysphagia ethiopica, which was a mental disorder that caused laziness, rascality, and lethargy in enslaved. He associated the causes of both of these quote-unquote disorders as the result of slave masters treating enslaved people as their equal. Cartwright also suggested that these disorders could be treated by brutalizing enslaved Black people through whipping, branding, and other forms of torture to physically impair them from running. Both of these quote-unquote disorders were invented by Cartwright as yet another attempt to provide false scientific evidence that upheld white supremacy and justified the enslavement of Black people. But we've seen this before. Cartwright is only one of the many examples of medical professionals coining and spreading false and racially motivated medical information in order to marginalize people of color.
Yeah, Chase, to add another example, in 1792, physician Benjamin Rush coined the term negritude to describe an illness supposedly suffered by slaves, of which the only cure was to become white. And now this idea that being Black in itself is an illness is one overtly racist. But I think it's a good segue into talking about how the weight you carry while being Black in America affects your mental health. Because the condition of the Black American is a very uniquely stressful one. 400 years of racism and discrimination, which is still present today, definitely does weigh a heavy burden emotionally and mentally. Earlier this year, Black Americans, every American would turn on the TV and just see Black death, which is very traumatic and a very mentally taxing situation to be in. So no, while being Black in itself is not an illness, definitely the weight that comes with being Black in America can definitely cultivate one. And it's unfortunate because there is a stigma within the Black community in regards to seeking mental health services. Black and other POC disproportionately receive less mental health services than their white counterparts. And I think this is a perfect segue to the KST, where we will talk about this more.
KST. It's piping hot.
Part of the reason why this stigmatization in regard to mental health exists is because there is a lack of representation within the mental health community, so to speak. And we talked about this in episode 1 as to why representation is so important. This is one of the many reasons. But according to the American Psychological Association, in 2015, around 86% of psychologists in the U.S. are white, while only 5% are Hispanic and 4% are Black. And obviously this is very important and concerning because having a shared cultural background and knowledge allows clients to feel more comfortable with seeking mental health services and speaking to a therapist, and allows therapists to better understand some more racially specific problems. And it also serves to dismantle the stigmas that POC face when seeking help, as well as racial biases that exist within the medical fields.
Right, and not only is the lack of psychiatrists of color really important to keep in mind when talking about mental health, but also other compounding factors that impact, our relationships with mental health, such as, the fact that Black men are 6 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia instead of mood disorders or post-traumatic stress disorders than white men are. Also, just the general mistrust that people of color tend to have when it comes to medical professionals because of previous experiences of medical racism and things of that nature. And, all of these different factors make me think about how do our own identities impact our perspective and relationship with mental health.
I think about that question a lot, and I think it's a very important question to pose and for our listeners to ponder. And I want to ask you the same question and turn it around. How does your identity impact your perspective and your relationship with mental health?
I think being a Black American, but also being, an Afro-Caribbean, those two things really affect my relationship with mental health because, as the child of an immigrant, you're traditionally taught, that these mental health issues aren't really issues. They're just things you kind of have to deal with and push through in order to, just keep it pushing. And I think that a lot of that has to do with this mentality that we have, not only as Caribbean immigrants, but just as people of color, to persevere, to push through all the hardships that we face, to work even harder, sort of ignore some of the issues that we might be facing because, those issues aren't real or those issues don't matter as much as the overt forms of racism that we faced in the past. And I think that starts to negatively affect my relationship with mental health just because instead of addressing some of the problems, you kind of just pretend that they aren't there because, your parents or your relatives tell you that they aren't there, that you just need to sort of just deal with it and muscle and push through it. And I think there's a big stigma behind getting help or seeking help when dealing with mental health issues. And, there's almost this guilt attached to it, kind of oh, your family is not good enough to help you out with these things. Why are you going to go seek help? Aren't we enough help for you?
No, I definitely agree with the sentiment that growing up, mental health was never really taken seriously. In my household, it was always in yours, just kind of swept under the rug, where if I was ever feeling sad or otherwise mentally unwell and I go to my parents, they just kind of dismiss it. Sometimes aggressively, oh, what do you have to be sad about? You're just a child, you're a teen, you have nothing to worry about, go clean them dishes. And it got to the point where those problems were just delegitimized so often that I would stop going to my parents, who, as when you're young, they're kind of your first stop when you are experiencing emotional, mental issues. And I just started solving them myself, which worked for a while. It's not the best practice. I think I cultivated some harmful misconceptions that way because somewhere along the way, I thought that you were stronger if you dealt with your mental issues alone and that you got some sort of reward. But in truth, no one gives you a sticker for dealing with your mental issues alone. No one gives you a cookie. There's no prize. And you're not any more stronger than someone who does seek mental health services. And it got to the point where I felt like I needed to talk to someone, and it was the best decision of my life. Dr. Payetti, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably aren't, but I will bring it up in our next session. So, so you can listen to this. I love talking to you. And I think I tell my friends this all the time. I think everyone could benefit from seeking professional help. I think something that definitely helped me destigmatize seeking mental health. That's not always feasible for everyone. There are financial barriers, but any mental health service you can get, I do recommend.
Another important thing to mention is that part of the stigmatization just comes from, obviously past histories of medical racism, past histories of having these resources stripped away from communities and replacing mental health facilities with prisons and jails and more police. And also just a matter of affordability. Like, not everyone can afford to have a therapist, or not everyone can even afford health insurance. And all of these things compound to form the relationships that different communities of color have with mental health and discussing mental health. But one thing that I think is also important to mention that you said before is, coming to college and sort of realizing that mental health is a normal thing to deal with and is a thing and is something that we should all be seeking help about, if we feel like we need to address these issues. And we'll sort of talk about navigating mental health and mental wealth as a college student with our guest, Ella Bradford, and the Brown Breakdown.
It's the Brown Breakdown.
Today, John and I are joined by my good friend, Ella Bradford. Ella is a third-year undergrad at the University of Chicago, double majoring in anthropology and history with a minor in statistics. Originally from the ATL, Atlanta, Georgia, she is very interested in public and mental health initiatives. Ella is currently the co-chair of the Health and Wellness Ad Hoc Committee within student government and is going to tell us a little bit about her work on the committee and protecting your energy as a college student. Please give a warm welcome to Ella Bradford, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited. I know Chase and I am lucky enough to have met Chase like my first day on campus. And during our friendship, we've been lucky enough to have some good conversations, some good honest conversations about mental health. So I'm excited to get into it with you guys.
Yes, well, why don't we get into it? Well, I feel like mental health has been steadily destigmatized over the past few years, but this is a process. Is there anything you've had to unlearn in regards to your mental health? And also, what made you want to join the mental or health and wellness committee at UChicago? And what work do you do and what challenges do you face? If you could just get into that first.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a lot of questions wrapped up in that. I guess one of the first things that I think about being like really important to me when it comes to like unpacking and destigmatizing mental health is an idea that like everyone has mental health to take care of. I think for a long time when I was younger and stuff like that, I really thought mental health was like you're in crisis or you're normal, and that it was kind of this like binary state. And you would go to therapy if you're in crisis, but otherwise, you're pretty normal and you're just kind of going about your day. But I think something that was important for me to learn and get comfortable with is the idea that like we've all got mental health that we have to take care of, and it's very much so a spectrum, and it's very much so something that we can all be taking care of each day, doing things about each day, and just paying attention to. It's not necessarily crisis or nothing. It's very much so like we've all got to do our part to take care of ourselves, just like, you take a shower, brush your teeth, whatever. Got to figure out what that looks like for mental health. And so I guess for the Health and Wellness Committee, I was really excited about it because I think at UChicago specifically, I had difficulty accessing mental health care when I was a first year. There were a variety of things that happened that made me kind of take a step back and say, I think I would benefit from talking to someone about this. I'm relying on my friends a lot. I'm relying on the support systems I've created, and I'm so grateful for all of them. But there comes a point in time when you're kind of like, maybe I should talk to like a professional about this. Maybe I should not just, talk about this across like the Bartlett table. And I wanted to seek out care and had, I think, a similar story to a lot of people, struggled with the process of getting an appointment at student counseling services, was told there'd be like a 5-week wait for an intake appointment. And 5 weeks at UChicago is, half the quarter. There's so much there that feels like, what's going to happen in the next 5 weeks,
Yeah, and I think something that you mentioned before about coming to college and a lot of different things happening is something that every college student experiences. You know, college is a time of enormous changes, from the change to your living